Good evening, everyone. Good evening to you all. Welcome to this online lecture from the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. My name's David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. It's really a pleasure and an honor to introduce our speaker this evening, who is one of the most eminent scholars at work in the field of Jewish history and Israel studies. Derek Penslar is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History and the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University. His books include Jews and the Military, A History from 2013, Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, published in 2020, and Zionism, An Emotional State, published last year in 2023. He is currently writing a book titled The War for Palestine, 1947 to 1949, A Global History, and you will notice a resemblance between that project and his talk this evening. The 1948 Palestine War, from the local to the global. Derek will speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, after which we will have time for questions and discussion. But now it's all yours, Derek.
Great. Thank you, David. I hope that everyone can hear me. And I am going to share my screen. And just a moment, my presentation that was just here has disappeared because there's a trick for sharing a screen with a, let's see if that will work now. Sorry about the delay. Let's see, there we go. You're going to see a very thin presentation. It should open up. And then I will launch it. So hopefully you see a presentation. David, do you?
Yes, absolutely, Derek. Absolutely.
All right. So I'll get started. All right. Well, thank you, David. I'm really sorry that I had COVID last June. And so my wife, Robin, and I spent a lovely week in a hotel room in London, enjoying everything that the 12 by 12 room had to offer. But we didn't get to enjoy London, including coming to Birkbeck. So I'm going to start with this little and rather odd map from the early 2010s. This is the work of a German geographer named Benjamin Hennig. It was a series of maps that depicted the size of countries in terms of the number of articles about them in The Guardian in any particular year. And so you'll see here, this is from 2012. You see a swollen and obese United States, quite appropriate, an emaciated Latin America, massively enlarged European countries, rather shockingly small African and Asian ones. The Arab Middle East looms large, given the events of the time. We're talking about the early years of civil protest. In the Arab world, Israel, of course, is much larger than its size might otherwise indicate. And although Dr. Hennig, who teaches, by the way, at the University of Iceland, has not produced any more recent iterations of the map, it's safe to say that if we produce such a map today, Israel would be at least as large on the map, if not bigger, raising the question of why. Why Israel attracts so much attention, and why does it attract so much passion? And even now, after a year in which Israeli forces have killed scores of thousands in Gaza and destroyed much of the country's infrastructure and property, and killed thousands in Lebanon, also wrought a great deal of destruction, the answer is actually not as obvious as it might seem. Because at no time in history have people in the Western world, particularly those in elite campuses, been so exercised about a conflict. For example, American youth are quite exercised about Palestine right now. The last time they were like this was during the Vietnam War. But Americans were being sent to die in Vietnam. And the demonstrations in the US died down quite a bit after the draft was ended. The last major wave of campus protests was that against South Africa's apartheid regime in the 1970s and 80s, but they pale in comparison with the current moment. So to ask the question why Israel is actually quite important and valid, but it has to be approached with an open mind. I'm reminded of something that David himself, so David, this is now your shout out moment, that David said at a conference on boycotts held at Birkbeck some years ago, in which he talked about the concept of tu quoque, or what about. That is, what one can ask, what about Israel in comparison with the millions who have been killed and continue to be killed in Ethiopia or Sudan or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or what about the mass killings in Syria earlier, maybe still ongoing, but particularly a few years ago, but just now the massive Turkish bombardments, for example, of the autonomous zone in northeastern Syria. What about widespread Russian atrocities in Ukraine? One could ask. What about oppression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, the Sinicization of Tibet? They're all fair questions, I suppose. What about the fact that American students did not disrupt classes or occupy and vandalize buildings, nor did they set up encampments on American campuses when American forces using American bombs, those same kinds of bombs that are killing Palestinians now, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians during the Persian Gulf War? Now, those are fair questions, all of them, but only if they're asked as questions. Otherwise, they are simply a hostile riposte. They're a way to actually prevent discussion rather than promote it. That is, when people say "what about" in connection with Israel, it's usually an attempt to blame one's interlocutor, or someone if someone's being very highly critical of Israel, of anti-Semitism. Well, anti-Semitism has, as we're going to see, it has played a role in accounting for animus towards Israel, for sure. It is not the only factor. And throughout the 1900s, Palestine has served as a kind of affective magnet, which both attracts and generates emotions, such as religious fervor, anti-colonial anger, Holocaust guilt, and shame. Now, other global conflicts also evoke powerful emotions, but mainly within the region they are waged or within the communities that are directly involved in them. So Russia is obsessed with Ukraine, or they're obsessed with each other. The People's Republic of China with Taiwan. Ethnic strife in sub-Saharan Africa has killed millions, but few people in the Western world who are not of Russian, Chinese, or African origin are as emotionally invested in these struggles as they are in Israel-Palestine. So the fact that there are many students, for example, at universities wearing keffiyehs, many of them are not of Middle Eastern origin, but they're wearing keffiyehs. So why is this happening? Well, it could be explained in terms of the number of deaths, or the extent of Gaza's ruination, or that of Beirut or Tyre, or in the Palestinian status as an oppressed and occupied people. There are others: Kurds, Masalit, Rohingya, Sahrawis, Uyghurs, Yazidis. All national conflicts generate waves of emotion, but Israel-Palestine generates tsunamis. Or to switch metaphors, Israel-Palestine is a superconductor of emotional current. There's nothing like it. So why? And I think the answer lies in the past. During the 1800s, Palestine's ancient religious significance for Christians, Jews, and Muslims became politicized. First, Palestine fell into Europe's colonial orbit, and then it became an object of both Zionist yearnings for a Jewish homeland, but also a site of early Arab nationalism. Palestine's significance as a subject and object of political emotion expanded during the interwar period of the British mandate, or the League of Nations mandate, to Britain to govern Palestine. Now, Zionists at first found British rule to be exhilarating, but then after that infuriating, as their early expectations that they would be helped towards statehood gave way to accusations of betrayal as Britain tried to balance its commitments to Zionism with its geopolitical interests in the Arab world. The British mandate, though, managed to also exasperate and enrage Arabs and Muslims whose strivings for independence made progress throughout Asia, but not in Palestine. These politically framed emotions enhanced and were in turn enhanced by religious sentiment. In 1929, rumors that Jews were planning to purchase the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, provoked calls among Palestinians that, quote, Al-Aqsa is in danger, a phrase that we hear to this day. 2 years later, in 1931, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, and the Indian Muslim leader Shaukat Ali convened a World Islamic Conference in Jerusalem that strengthened perceptions that the Palestine issue was not only an Arab one, but also a global and Muslim one. So all of this was in place long before 1948. After World War II, though, things ratcheted up. Palestine became a symbol of anti-colonial aspirations, just as the world's Jews, reeling from the genocide of 2/3 of European Jewry, united around the call for a Jewish state. And in the Western world, which had perpetrated the Holocaust or abetted it or stood by doing nothing when it took place, the fate of Jews was a sensitive subject, best dealt with by shunting the Jewish survivors out of Europe and into Palestine. During the immediate post-war years, the world was rife with crises: China, civil war in China, Greece, Turkey, anti-colonial uprisings in Indonesia and in Indochina, the division of Europe between East and West, and yet the Palestine question, as it was known, had the greatest global reach. So what we have is a period between 1947, when the United Nations debated the future of Palestine and voted on partition, and 1949, by which time the war had ended, Israel had been established, and the Nakba, or the dispossession of the Palestinian people, had occurred. This is a period when global discourse on Palestine took another leap forward, or another leap in terms of depth and intensity. Now, this was a global phenomenon, and the book I'm writing is indeed an attempt at global history, which I'm not going to cover all of in this talk. For example, I'm not going to talk about North America, but I am going to talk about 4 parts of the world, admittedly with rather audacious and breathtaking speed, because this is literally a tour d'horizon, and I'm developing all these things more in the book. I'm going to talk about the Middle East, or the Arab Middle East, South Asia, or the subcontinent, a couple of examples from Europe, and then I'm going to finish with Latin America. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground very quickly, just to give you a sense of where the project is headed. So let's start with the Middle East and then South Asia. Now, the basic approach within the Middle East in 1947, when the United Nations approached the Palestine question, was one of really incredulity and indignity that the United Nations even would take up this issue and formulate any policy other than granting immediate independence to Palestine as a Arab state. The Arab League, for example, or the representatives of the Arab League in the UN, were furious that the UN would assume the authority to influence or try to intervene in Palestine's natural path towards independence. Now, the umbrella group of Arab political parties, the Arab Higher Committee, Palestinian political parties, the Arab Higher Committee, boycotted the UN's inquiries. But in July of 1947, members of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine met in Geneva with the Palestinian leader Musa Alami, and they also met in Beirut with a number of Arab diplomats from Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. And here are 3 of the most important right here. Now, all 3 of these gentlemen, plus their fellow Arab diplomats, were united that the only alternative at this point was statehood for the Arabs of Palestine. They made appeals to universal human rights, the principle of popular sovereignty, and the Arabs' historic presence in Palestine. They depicted Zionism as a handmaid of British and also American colonialism. And following a long line of anti-Zionists, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, they claimed that Jews did not constitute a nation and therefore had no right to self-determination. They claimed that Jews constituted a religious community and as such would be guaranteed full freedom of religious life, religious practice in an Arab state as a minority. Now, these are arguments that one may agree with or not, but they rested on certain historical and ethical foundations. But the resentment and anger that fueled them led also to an embrace of overtly anti-Semitic views. So, for example, Faris al-Khoury, an eminent Syrian politician and diplomat, told the United Nations General Assembly that Jews had no claim on Palestine because 90% of East European Jews were descended from, as he said, Slavs, Germans, Franks, and Khazars, with no connection to the ancient Middle East. This so-called Khazar hypothesis, attributing the origins of Ashkenazic Jews to a dubious mass conversion in the medieval Khazar kingdom in the Caucasus, was commonly invoked in Arab critiques of Zionism at the time and has remained popular to this day. But I want to quote from El-Khoury to get a sense of the ease with which what one might call a rights-based criticism of Zionism moved into something much darker. Quote, "The choice of Palestine to satisfy Zionist aspirations was based not on humanitarian sympathy," this is El-Khoury speaking, "but on the intentions of Zionists in the US to launch an economic invasion of the entire Eastern world and to achieve that, and by creating a bridgehead in Palestine to be the headquarters of their activities. Such a state," he claimed, "would rely on the United States and on the Zionists, quote, co-religionists in the United States who were flooding Palestine's Jewish community with dollars." These are all his words. And as fighting between Arabs and Jews in Palestine broke out in late 1947 and then beyond, Arab public rhetoric shifted and seesawed between realistic assessments of the military power of the Zionists, later the State of Israel, and more fantastic assessments. So, for example, in January of 1948, the Austrian ambassador to Ankara spoke of a fear among Arab diplomats in the capital that the Zionists would infiltrate territory accorded to the Arab state by the United Nations. Well, that's quite realistic, and that indeed is what happened. In May, however, the Jordanian ambassador to Ankara said that Palestine's Jews planned to conquer the entire Arab Levant and claimed that troops of the Jordanian Arab Legion had found maps of Mesopotamia, thus proving that the Jews planned to attack Iraq. A similar toggling between accuracy and baleful myth characterized pamphlets submitted by the Arab Higher Committee and by the Arab League in 1948 to the United Nations. Both pamphlets accused the Zionists of barbaric behavior and cruelty towards the Arabs of Palestine. Zionist actions, such as the notorious massacre of some 100 Arab civilians at the village of Deir Yassin on the western outskirts of Jerusalem, might have justified such an accusation, but the pamphlets went much beyond that. And I'm quoting now from the Arab Higher Committee pamphlet that claimed that, quote, the cold-blooded and well-calculated Zionist plan for the massacre of populations is a renewal of the technique adopted for them when they first entered Palestine about the year 1400 BC. According to the pamphlet, the Zionists have a long-standing status as Jews of being, quote, international intriguers, controllers of the channels of propaganda in important countries. As the pamphlet said, Jewish global power has enabled the construction of a, and I'm quoting, totalitarian, fanatic, and terrorist community in Palestine, equal in barbarism to the Nazis. And the pamphlet even claimed that the Jewish forces were crucifying Arab prisoners. Now, the language reflected hatred, informed by a deep-seated fear, stoked by the United Nations approval of the partition of Palestine. As the scholar Mohammed Ali Adrawi has written, the moment that the day after the partition resolution was passed, the Syrian Minister of Education, Munir Ajilani, spoke of the need to liberate Palestine and conserve Arabism in spite of the great world conspiracy against us. Ajilani feared what he called an impending catastrophe, or Nakba, for Syria and the entire Arab world. And at the same time, Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, described Palestine as the Muslim world's first line of defense. And he claimed that indeed the creation of Israel was the product of a Jewish conspiracy against the Arab world and against the religion of Islam. Now, this use of the term Nakba to describe the entire Arab world and not just the Palestinians is telling, because the word Nakba was associated really increasingly from the 1970s with the plight of the Palestinian refugees and their desire for return. At the time, though, 1948, the term really referred to the Arab world as a whole, as popularized by Constantine Zurayek, a Greek Orthodox Arab scholar from Syria, who wrote The Meaning of Catastrophe, a pamphlet in which he spoke of the disunity, weakness, and backwardness of the Arab world, as opposed to what he considered to be the strength and fortitude of the Zionist enemy. Zurayek saw Israel as the greatest threat to the creation of a powerful and vibrant Arab polity. He worried that if the state of Israel were to be created, and I'm quoting from him, the Zionist danger will gradually permeate our sickly, worn body with a cancerous taint. One day we will wake up and lo, all of Palestine will be in the hands of this energetic, militant Zionist minority. But even more worrying, he claimed in a broadcast on radio in 31 May 1948, quote, the facility that the Zionist forces have for growth and expansion will place the Arab world forever at their mercy and will paralyze its vitality and deter its progress and evolution in the ladders of its civilization. That is, if this Arab world is permitted to exist at all. We struggle simply to defend ourselves against a treacherous aggression and to protect our very existence. So there's genuine fear here, and the line between manipulation and sincere belief was blurry. So for example, shortly after, there's Constantine Saraic, and there is the meaning of disaster. Shortly after the Deir Yassin massacre, in April of 1948, Hussein Fakhri al-Khalidi, secretary of the Arab Higher Committee, directed the Arab Service of the Palestine Broadcast Service, or the Palestine Broadcast Corporation, to depict the atrocities in the most gruesome terms, including descriptions of the rape of women, which he himself at the time acknowledged did not occur. Al-Khalidi hoped that lurid narratives about Jewish atrocities would bolster the Palestinians' determination to fight against the Zionist enemy and would dissuade them from fleeing the country, although the opposite was, in fact, the case. So we have a situation in which, even if Arabs at times intentionally exaggerated the Jews' malevolence, this malevolence was taken for granted. That is, in 1947 and 48, Arab fear and hatred of the Jews of Palestine was entangled with a fear and hatred of Jews as such across time and space. But we get a very different set of reactions in the Muslim world of the subcontinent. It's a really interesting subject that Muslims of the subcontinent had a long history of sympathy for the Palestinian Arab cause. Now, in 1947 and 1948, those sympathies were overwhelmed by their own trauma of the partition of India, which between August of 1947 and early 1948 led to the mass flight of about 10 million Hindus and Muslims and the deaths of 1 million or more as a result of intercommunal violence. Now, perhaps because of this, or perhaps because of the relative physical distance between the subcontinent and the Arab Muslim heartland, the political rhetoric of Indian Muslim leaders in 1948 was relatively free from anti-Semitism. So here we have Muhammad Zafarullah Khan, who after partition became Pakistan's first foreign minister. Now, he was a fierce critic of Zionism. So was the Muslim League, the political party that since the early 20th century had championed the interests of Indian Muslims. But in Khan's memoirs, he chided his Arab counterparts in the United Nations for having weakened what he called solid arguments with speech that was, and I'm quoting Khan, largely emotional, and the speakers spent most of their time in a vain effort to prove that the Jews coming to settle in Palestine were not the descendants of Abraham, but belonged to a Russian tribe named Khazar, whose forefathers in a distant past had converted to Judaism. The Arab cause in all of its aspects was so strong, but to support it with such irrelevant arguments amounted to weakening it. Now, Khan, again, was not a Zionist. He tried to think of a way to solve the problem of Palestine through federation, which he proposed in 1940, coming up with a scheme that would have called for neither population transfer nor partition. He worried that, quote, the forcible creation of a Jewish state within the heart of the Arab world would constitute a serious factor of disturbance, not only within the boundaries of Palestine, but would also jeopardize the peace and security of the Middle East. Khan argued something similar in 1947 before the United Nations. The Muslim League also opposed partition. And at the time, there were people who said that since partition had taken place in India, the same thing would be justified in Palestine, to which Muslim League leaders responded forcefully that in the case of India, Pakistan, there was mutual agreement about partition, whereas in the case of Palestine, only one side wanted partition, so you couldn't compare the two. And that in the case of Palestine, there were no areas where Jews were actually a majority of the population, whereas in India, in the areas where Muslims were a majority of the population, those areas went to Pakistan. Majority Hindu areas stayed with India. So the Pakistani leaders vigorously disagreed with any justification for Zionism. And a thoughtful critique of Zionism also came from a member of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, Mohammed Abdul Rahman, who was personally deeply affected and traumatized by partition. While he was working for the UN, his country was being torn apart, and his family was forced to flee its home in Delhi, barely making it to Lahore with the clothes on their backs. Under pressure from Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Abdur Rahman proposed to the United Nations a Jewish Arab Federation similar to Khan's idea, although Abdur Rahman himself would have preferred a unitary state. But he worried that unless a federation were created, Palestine would fall into endless war. As he wrote in 1948, "There is no other land in the whole world which arouses so much religious sentiment and feeling." And in 1949, once he was safely ensconced in Lahore, he wrote back to another member of the UN Committee on Palestine, the Canadian judge Ivan Rand. And Rand had supported the creation of a Jewish state. And Abdul Rahman writes to him, "Please do not call me presumptuous. I say this with all humility, but I still feel that federation was and probably would be the best solution of Palestine. It would have been for my country also." So that's the Muslim Indian view. The Hindu view was similar. The Indian National Congress opposed partition, and for similar reasons. Nehru's sister, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, she was the Indian ambassador to the UN, and at one point she cabled her brother, saying the Arab demand is based on the same principles of right and self-determination and freedom, which the Indian National Congress has always fought for. The Indian press during the partition debates was strongly in favor of independent Palestinian statehood. And yet, nonetheless, in 1948, the Times of India was critical of both sides, at one point claiming that both Jews and Arabs, I'm quoting, are inspired by and victims of narrow, essentially selfish and sectional interests. And by September of 1948, when it was clear that Israel had won the war, the Times of India wrote, not in a tone of celebration, but just pragmatic acknowledgement that, quote, actual and effective partition had been achieved by Jewish aims. That is, the state of Israel existed. So we have a very different attitude here in the subcontinent that is decidedly pro-Palestinian, but I'd say it's pro-Palestinian much more on the grounds of, again, universal human rights and national self-determination, and so far as I can tell, rarely indulged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. Now, I'll talk briefly about Europe, where philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism both flourished after the war, and both philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism reflected the ongoing, really the effects of the Holocaust, which inspired guilt and shame and denial among many in Europe. I'm just going to very briefly refer to a couple of examples because this is a chapter in and of itself, but in France, there was a great deal of sympathy for the Zionist cause, largely because of an assertion that had a kernel of truth, that Jews had been involved heavily in the resistance in France in World War II. So there was a sense of solidarity with Jews for that reason, but also an exaggeration of the role of the French people themselves in that resistance. So this combination of solidarity, sympathy, guilt, and denial led to a kind of redefinition of the young state of Israel as an extension of the French resistance, or the Maquis. So France's most prominent journalist in 1948 was Joseph Kessel, a Jew of Russian origin, famous for his novel Belle de Jour. Those of you of a certain age might remember the novel or the film with Catherine Deneuve. Anyway, he was elected to the Académie Française. So he was a man of some stature who spent the 48 war as a journalist for Le Nouvel Observateur. And he wrote from Palestine in a way that was clearly filled with Zionist pride, but he was writing for a general audience. He wasn't writing for Jewish readers. And when he wrote of his intense admiration for the Israelis, their calmness, their dedication, and so forth, He specifically and repeatedly used the language of the Maquis. He says here, the Israeli fighters maintain, quote, the traditions of the Maquis, the partisan fighters and colonial engagements. He wrote that the Jewish state was a vast Maquis, and their battles were maquisard expeditions. They had no uniforms, he writes. They possessed only light arms. They kept their names and faces secret. He claimed that, quote, the extraordinary Jewish people constituted a sort of foreign legion that had gathered on the soil of its ancestors, which is a very weird notion because the Foreign Legion, of course, did not fight on home soil. They fought on foreign soil. But he was appealing to a French audience, and I think his comments were quite sincere. He wasn't apologizing for Zionism, but he was depicting Palestine as a state that in the best French and French colonial tradition was simultaneously settler colonial and anti-colonial, and this is something that gave him great pride. So that's an example of a philo-Semitism. However, there's a great deal of ambivalence, if not outright opposition, to Israel's establishment in the very countries that perpetrated the Holocaust in Germany. Now, Germany was not a country to speak of in 1948. It was under Allied occupation, but there was a relatively free German press, which devoted an inordinate amount of attention to the creation of the State of Israel. German newspapers at the time came out 2 or 3 times a week. They were 8 pages. They had maybe 1 page of foreign news, but Israel was there almost all the time, appearing for weeks on end. And the newly founded news magazine, Der Spiegel, in 1948 covered Israel in almost 30 issues, as opposed to 20 for China, 12 for Greece, 7 for India, and 5 for Indonesia. Now, there was very little in the way of commentary in these articles, but a lot of factual coverage. And the fact that they chose to talk about Israel tells you something. But there was downright hostility and overt hostility in what was probably the most prestigious German newspaper of the immediate post-war era, Die Zeit, published in Hamburg in the British zone. And their foreign correspondent in the Middle East was the formidable Marion Gräfin von Dönhoff. She was herself an aristocrat from an East Prussian family. She had been something of a monarchist. She was not a Republican, small r Republican, but she was also an anti-Semite. And for her, Israel was a problem. And she wrote about it in 1948. She wrote that Israel was a foreign body. Israel ist ein Fremdkörper, a foreign body that stands in the way of a territorially contiguous Arab realm. She claimed that this foreign body would never solve the Jewish problem, die Judenfrage, as she called it. She said that Israel was simultaneously a staging ground for Soviet communism and a continuation of Nazism in the form of which she called a noxious and extreme chauvinistic nationalism. And by the way, Marion Gräfin von Dönhoff went on to become the chief editor and co-publisher of the newspaper and one of the most formidable figures in post-World War II journalism in Germany. Der Spiegel was usually more positive about Israel, but it featured quite a bit of anti-Semitic reportage in writing about displaced persons. That is, the Jews who had survived the war, they'd been uprooted, they could not return home, their Eastern European homelands would not accept them, they wound up in refugee camps in Germany and Austria. And when some of them wound up in Israel, Der Spiegel wrote about them in explicitly anti-Semitic terms, talking of women who had been on the SS Exodus, the refugee ship. She writes, these women today in Israel, they wear gold rings, are manicured, made up, with banknotes piling up in their husband's briefcase. The same article describes Tel Aviv as containing the concentrated financial power of world Jewry, which is not really true. And by the way, Austria, which did have a government in 1949, I found in the Austrian Foreign Ministry archives correspondence between the Austrian diplomats stationed in Amman, Cairo, Ankara, and so forth, with Vienna, and you just see an explicit and ongoing anti-Semitism. So, for example, the ambassador to Turkey from Vienna writes in 1948 that the Israeli leadership is divided between, quote, Western democratically oriented Jews and outcast Eastern Jews who know no limits. The diplomats wrote openly about Jews as being financially and economically powerful, both in the United States and even in Israel. So there we then see an emotional response that is quite cool, and that is based on really an completely unprocessed guilt, or maybe even refusal to feel guilty at all for the atrocities of the Second World War. My time is short, so I'm going to finish very briefly by talking about Latin America, which matters a great deal for a couple of reasons. It was far away from Palestine. And so, in a way, the discourse was a bit more abstract. It was a bit less intense. And yet there was a good deal of attachment and admiration and solidarity with Israel, largely, I think, because of the common hatred of Francoism, and fascism. There were what were called pro-Palestine committees. You see this in the slide, really throughout the Latin America. Every Latin American country had a pro-Palestine committee, and this was to be pro-Palestine at that time meant to be a Zionist. So the pro-Palestine committees were Zionists. These committees usually consisted of lawyers, doctors, notaries, judges, leaders of the countries, and they were quite adamant and energetic in lobbying government for support for the establishment of a Jewish state. And then there were diplomats like Enrique Rodriguez Fabregat from Uruguay, or Jorge Garcia Granados from Guatemala, who were on the UN committee and were just steadfastly supportive of Zionism. Fabregat because of his humanitarianism, and Garcia Granados because of his hatred of Britain, because the British controlled what at that time was called British Honduras, next door, later Belize. But at the end of the day, what really mattered in the case of Latin America, and the reason I'm finishing with it, is because you had sizable Jewish communities, immigrant Jewish communities, but you also had sizable Arab communities. Arab immigrants from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, largely Christian communities, and they were very similar in numbers and in occupation. They were in commerce and in political clout. And so in Latin America, unlike elsewhere in the world in 1947-48, you had both Arab pro-Palestine, pro-Palestinian, and pro-Zionist blocs competing, for example, with the like of Juan Perón of Argentina, who would receive one delegation one day and tell them things they wanted to hear, and then receive another delegation the next day and tell them things they wanted to hear. The publications that were produced by, let's say, the Zionists and by the pro-Palestinians are, as it were, kind of battling against each other. So you had the pro-Palestine committee Honor y Patria in Buenos Aires competing with the pro-Palestine committee in that same city. And it's precisely because of this level of equity or of equality between the two forces that we see in Latin America, half dozen Latin American countries abstained on the vote on partition in 1947. And there was a good deal of American pressure for them to vote for partition, but a lot of them decided to abstain, sometimes as an assertion of autonomy against the US. But in the case of Mexico, Argentina, Chile, whose president was himself a Zionist, Gabriel González Videla was himself a Zionist, but he abstained. It was largely because of this rather equally balanced political community. And so I mention this because, and I'm finishing with this now, this competition between Jewish and Arab groups, between those supporting the Palestinian cause and Zionism, is really, I would say, more indicative historically of our own era than what I've been talking about so far, as the United States has become more diverse, the United Kingdom, obviously, quite diverse, and pro-Palestinian voices have become increasingly vocal in recent years and recent decades. So I'm finishing then with a final historical reference that has contemporary relevance, and that is to Mexico. So during the time of the 1948 war, the foreign minister of Mexico, Jaime Torres Bodet, wrote, "Personal sympathy makes me prone to understand the Jewish cause, but the historic rationale and the memory of the case of Texas forces me to imagine, as a Mexican, that the Arab people would the reaction that the Arab people would necessarily have." And this was driven home a little later in November of 1947, just before the UN vote. The newspaper of record in Mexico, Excelsior, used the comparison of Texas. Now, I should explain to an English audience. So This refers to the 2/3 of Mexico that was taken by the United States exactly a century previously via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the end of the Mexican-American War. So, as Excelsior writes, the colonization of a territory belonging to an economically weak and naturally more organized people, less organized people, by organized groups with much greater economic power, would give birth to another injustice instead of solving the one committed against the Jews. I mean, this is really clearly a reference in which Mexicans are like the Palestinians and the Jews are like the Americans. Whoever has suffered in flesh and blood the experience of Texas and everything else that occurred there has the authority to present themselves in every way as a defender of the right of people to govern themselves. So he's using the example of his country's own history and projecting it onto Palestine. And that a tendency to filter events in Palestine through a national lens has remained common to this day. When we think of how the Palestine issue has been received in the United States, for example, through the lens of racial tensions, black-white relations in the United States, epitomized by Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent collection of essays, The Message, in which the comparison or the conflation is quite explicit. Okay, final paragraph. The partition of Palestine in 1948, in 1947, and the 1948 war riveted the world. The emotional matrix framing Israel-Palestine at the time of the war, anti-colonial anger and frustration, a mixture of shame, guilt, and compassion in response to the Holocaust had very long half-lives. But so did anti-Semitism, as we saw from the German and the Austrian quotations. The same dynamic was present, as we've just seen, in Latin America. And I finish with a final piece of evidence. The same day that Excelsior published, I would say, a politically driven criticism for the creation of a Jewish state based on the notions of self-determination and national right, that same day they published an editorial that claims that wherever they are, Jews isolate themselves without mixing themselves or even less merging themselves with those whom they live with. And sorry for the grammatical weirdness, but it's my attempt to translate from Spanish. Due to their cohesion and solidarity, the editorial ran, the Jews are able to rapidly triumph in all means, finally becoming hated and provoking the most extraordinary explosions of violence against them. That is, in other words, the Jews deserve to be hated, perhaps not for killing Christ, but for their invariable success. In other words, anti-Semitism is present here at the very end. We realize then how difficult it is to separate the strands of popular attitudes towards Israel-Palestine: Christian and Muslim fervor, anti-Semitism, philo-Semitism, anti-colonialism, altruistic humanitarianism, and geopolitical self-interest. What is clear, though, is the magnitude and the intensity of feelings about Palestine in the immediate post-war period, feelings created by an interaction of multiple and overlapping historical forces of such strength and intensity as to form a singularity, an effective black hole possessed of incalculable power. Thank you.